We're now on Daf Ayin Beis Amid Beis, and the Gemara is trying to explain the machlokas about Moshuch, whether the Milah has to be Bayom or Balayla. My love, the Hakam Mifligi, on the second line. The machlokas between the Tanakama and Rebbe Lazar is the Marsav, according to the Tanakama, Moshuch da Oraisa, which is against Rav Huna, and the requirement of a second Milah in the case of Moshuch is that the Torah requires a Milah. Now there's no Milah because of Moshuch. And therefore, according to the Tanakama, we're going to require Milah Bayom, because that's all we know is the institution of Milah Bayom. And that applies even Shelo B'zman. Umar Savar, and Rabbi Loz, on the other hand, holds that Moshuch D'Rabbanan. So since Moshuch is only D'Rabbanan, reflecting the Shita of Rav Huna, as we saw earlier, therefore, the Torah doesn't require Milah in such a case, and we could allow Milah even at night. So the Machlokes Tanoim now, according to this Mailam Bahaka Miflagi Havamina, is whether or not Moshuch requires Milah D'Oraisa or D'Rabbanan. B'Tizbra, the Gemara rejects this. Is this really the reason of the Machlokes, whether you can do the Milah Balayla or it requires Yom? Does it depend upon whether Milah is D'Rabbanan or D'Oraisa? How could you say such a thing? In the very same brisa, it says Katan Shavar Zmano. We know that a Katan after the 8th day is Chayav Milah D'Oraisa. And yet, Rabbi Lazar says that the Milah could take place at night. You can't tell me that the reason why Rabbi Lazar holds that these cases enumerated in the brisa allow Milah Balayla is because it's the Rabbanan. You're talking about a child after the 8th day. No one holds that the Chiyav Milah of a child after the 8th day is only the Rabbanan. For sure, it's D'Oraisa. So we're going to have to come up with a different explanation of the Machlokes. And the Machlokes does not revolve around whether the Chiyav Milah is D'Oraisa or D'Rabbanan, or D'Kuli Alma Moshuch D'Rabbanan. And we're going to see in the context of Moshuch D'Rabbanan whether Milah in Moshuch D'Rabbanan is Balayla or Dafka Bayom would depend upon the D'Oraisa enterprise of Milah, which means that the Rabbanan are going to mold the Chiyav Milah D'Rabbanan in the case of Moshuch after the pattern of Milah D'Oraisa. Katan Shavar Zmano D'Oraisa. So now we're going to go back to Katan, Liachar Zmano, and that's going to give us the pattern of D'Oraisa, and then we can take Moshuch D'Rabbanan and fit it into the pattern D'Oraisa. Do you have the structure here? Because all the Tika Rabbanan came D'Oraisa. So now we're going back to D'Oraisa, and we're trying to figure out how to mold the Chiyav Milah in the case of Shelo B'zmana on a D'Oraisa level with regard to Laila. Marsavar, according to the Tanakama, Darshinon Ubayom. The Torah says Ubayom Hashmini Yimol Besar or Losam. And that's a pasuk of Vayikra Yud Beis at the beginning of Parashas Shmini. So the extra vav, according to Tanakama, is telling me what is the din of Milah Shelo B'zman, right? The Yom HaShmini is Milah B'zmano, and Ubiyom is equating Shelo B'zmano when it's after the 8th day with B'zmano. And therefore, in the context of that drasha, just like Yom HaShmini, Milah B'zmano requires Yom and excludes Laila, so too Milah Shelo B'zmano with the U, meaning adding it like as if it said Ubayom HaTshi, Ubayom HaShmini, equating Yom HaTshi, Shelo B'zmano with Yom HaShmini, you require Milah Bayom, Umar Savar, but Rabbi Lazar doesn't have this drasha of U. Lo Darshinon, the Vav of Ubayom is not subject to a drasha. And therefore, you are free in Mila Shalom Bismano to have a continuum of time after the 8th day. Once you pass the 8th day, then Laila Yom continues ad infinitum, and there's no distinction between Laila and Yom because he doesn't have the drasha of U to be Marbe Shalom Bismano requiring Yom. Now, if that be the case, now we can begin to understand the machlokas about Moshe. According to the Tanakama, there is no such enterprise. There's no such entity in the Torah perspective, in the world, the constellation of Mila, as Mila Balayla. It just doesn't exist. Mila, by definition, always requires Yom, and therefore, when the Rabbanan established a Chiv Mila in Moshe, they patterned it after the Doraisa, and there's no such thing as Mila Balayla at all. Whereas according to Rabbi Lazar, who has an entity of Mila Balayla in the case of Mila Shalom Mitzvah, like a cotton after the 8th day, where night and day all mix together and they flow one into the other, then Moshe, which is Mila Shalom Bismano by definition, the first Mila round was patterned, now it's Shalom Bismano. The Rabbanan are going to pattern it after Mila Shalom Bismano Dorais. And like the case of a cotton Shalom Bismano, where a blazar allows the Mila to be Bein B'Yom Bein Malaylas, it's a continuous mitzvah. It's what you call a mitzvah loss, because it's not limited in time once you pass the 8th day. So too, Moshe, which is Shalom Bismano, is Bein B'Yom Bein Malayla. As it comes out now, Kuli Amalo Pligi, that Moshe is the Rabbanan. So that's great news for Rav Huna. The Gemara now gives us a parallel case of Ubayom, where there's going to be an issue whether we darshan the Vav or not. And this has to do with the mitzvah of Sreifas Nosar. Ki Hadi Yosef Rabbi Yochanan v'Kadosh. Rabbi Yochanan gave the following presentation. Whereas Nosar Bismano in an Israel B'Yom requires Sreifa B'Yom, because the Torah in Vayikra Perek Zayin says, "Va'nosar mibsar hazevach bayom hashlishi, va'eshi tzar yom." But Shalom Bismanu, once you pass the Yom Hashlishi, and the Sreifa didn't take place yet, is Nisra Bein B'Yom and Bein Balayla. And this is based on the extra Vav. So 1 second. He says here that Nosar is Psar Kodjim, Shemitzuim Li'ochlo B'toch Perik Zman Mitzum. So you have to eat it within a certain time period. Lo Espiku La'ochlo, Hanosim Men Le'achar Zman Achiloso, Tziv Sator L'Sorfa. The pasuk is referring to Psar Shlomim, and the Torah gave it 2 days and 1 night. And the Torah says that after that second day passes, you don't burn it the night afterwards, which would be Leil Shlishi, but rather you postpone the Sreifa until the next day, which is Yom Shlishi. So Vanosam Ibsar Pesach Shal Hanechal B'Yom HaRishon L'Machroso B'Yom HaShlishi V'Eishi Sarfa Balayla, meaning the night of the second night, going into the third day, Eino Nechal V'Eino Nisraf. You just keep it in abeyance, sort of. Okay, so that's that. Oh, the Eisvei Rabbi Lazar Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Lazar rejected Rabbi Yochanan on the following basis. How can you tell me that when it says that you have to burn the Nosar Bayom, that's only Bismana? Well, what about Mitzvahs Mila? Mila, we had the extra Vav, and it came to be Marbeh, that Mila Shalom Bismana requires Yom just like Mila Bismana. Right? Ainli ela minimol b'shmini shu nimol shenu nimol el b'yom minayin l'rabos l'tishal asor l'achadasor l'shneimasor, that also requires Yom. Talmud Lomer ubayom. So we darshan the Vav But Mila Shalobas Mana to tell me that it requires Yom. That's the sheet of the Tanakhama that we studied earlier. And therefore, in Nosar, it says Veha Nosar, and there's an extra vav. So that should teach me that Nosar, even Shalom Bismano, meaning after Yom HaShlishi, would require Sreifa by Yom, just like Nosar Bismano on Yom HaShlishi. Now, again, Rabbi Elazar is being a little bit unfair, so to speak, in attacking Rabbi Yochanan based on Tanakama, when we have the Shita of the Tana Rabbi Elazar, and his opinion was that we don't darshan the vav, and therefore Yom and Laila are equal, as we discussed earlier. That's Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon. This Amora here is Rabbi Elazar ben Tidas. But in any event, the point is that if Rabbi Elazar the Amora, in arguing against Rabbi Yochanan, wants to make a solid case against Rabbi Yochanan, he's going to have to square even with Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon the Tana, and that's what he does exactly now. Vafilu Laman, meaning according to Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, to lo darish vav, he doesn't have the drasha of vav in the ubayom, and therefore he allows Milah Shalom Tani B'Laila is nevertheless vav vehei darsh. If you have both, we have two letters that are redundant and unnecessary. We have a vav and a hey. For example, it says vehanosai. So it's not just the vav of ubiyom, but it's the vav and the hey. Then even Rabbi Elazar, meaning Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, the Tana, would agree that in such a case, we're going to have a ribui to teach me that even nosar shalom bismano, veha nosar, like nosar bismano requires yom to the exclusion of Laila. The Sreif has to take place during the daylight hours. Ishtet. Yochanan was at this point quiet, and Basa Denafik, he praises this Rabbi Elazar ben Pidas after he leaves, after Rabbi Elazar backs out. His Basa Denafik, when Rabbi Elazar left Amalei Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, he turns to Reish Lakish and he starts praising Rabbi Elazar. Ra'isi leben Pidas, Rabbi Elazar ben Pidas, sheyoshe v'doresh kimoshe mipi agvura. He praises him that the tzura in which the greats of the previous generation, the Tanoim were darshaning, was like Moshe mipi agvura. Now, he points out here that Rabbi Elazar ben Pidas technically was not a Tana, he was an Amora. And he's Rabbi Elazar Stam, B'chol HaShas, B'chol HaTalmud. Amalei Reish Lakish turns to Rabbi Yochanan in response and he says, Didehi, are you telling me that this drasha of Ubayom, which Rabbi Elazar brought as a kasha, like as if to say it's his own drasha, and he saw the drasha in the Tanakhama regarding Milah Shalom Zmana that it requires Yom, Masnisa, he explained in the Brisa. So in a sense, by praising Rabbi Elazar ben Pidas for his drasha, it's maybe he doesn't deserve such a praise because that drasha of Ubayom is explicit in the Brisa. Rabbi Yochanan asked him, Heicha Tanule, where is this Brisa? I didn't see it. And Reish Lakish answered him, B'Torah's Kohanim. Is then Rabbi Yochanan was so impressed that Nafak Tanya B'Tlasa Yom, he went out and he learned this Brisa in the Torah's Kohanim for a 3-day period of time. The Savra B'Tlasa Yarch. And even during a period of 3 months, he would look and study and investigate this Brisa. Now, at this point, Rabbi Osai, we're about to embark on a gigantic sugya. And this is going to be the overlap between Tuma Vitara, like, for example, Paraduma, and the Tara of Paraduma, which is called Hazah, and the laws of Tuma. We're going to have to talk about a Tumas Mes that requires Hazah and Yom Shlishi, Yom Shvi as part of the Paraduma, Mechatis process. We're going to talk about a different tumah, which is called Tful Yom. So let's just give the following introduction. If a Jew is contaminated with a corpse, a mess, and he wants to be Matayr himself, and then he goes back to eating Truma and Kodshim, then he needs Hazah with Mechatos of Efer Paraduma on Yom HaShlishi, Yom HaShvi L'Taros. After that process is complete, then he can eat Truma and Kodshim. The Mazeh, who's in charge of sprinkling the Mechatos on his body on Yom Shlishi and Yom Shvi, must be a Tahor. And this is derived in Parashas Chukas, Bamidbar Yutes, V'taval, B'mayim, Ish Tahor V'izah. Again, V'izah HaTahor Ala Tameh. Now, that's with regard to the Mazeh. Now let's shift our discussion to what's called a Tful Yom. Right, a Tful Yom means that he was already tovel to his tumah, but he needs what's called Hariv Shemesh. We have to wait until the sun sets. After that, he certainly is kosher lahazis the tar, and that's v'hiza hatar. He can do the hazah. And now the pasuk starts by saying Ishtar v'hiza, and then again it repeats v'hiza tar. This extra v'hiza tar is coming to be marbet, to expand the definition of a qualified mazeh to include even a tful yom that did not have herav shemesh. He is kosher lahazos under the pasuk v'hiza tar. And now we embark upon our sugya of orel. What's the status of an orel as far as hazah is concerned? Amar Abelazar, orel shehiza hazah asa kshera. Now, I would say that even though it says hazah asa kshera, which sounds like b'di'eved, unless I'm mistaken, I'm going to interpret it as l'chatfila. The l'chatfila is kosher hazah. Midi dahavi atful yom. He has the same status as a tful yom. Now again, a tful yom was somebody who was tameh. He was tovel to masa, and until hariv shemesh, until that period of time, let's say until Seisek Chavim, he's tameh as far as kodshim and truma is concerned, but yet he's tahar lechulin ula meiser sheni. Again, we're going to make a big deal about meiser sheni. And even though he is tahar in the sense that he was tovel, but the pasuk says in Vayikra Chav Beis v'lo yocham and hakodshim ki imrochatz b'sora b'mayim, and then it says uba shemesh v'taher v'achar yocham and hakodshim. So v'taher means, the word v'taher means after. Give me 1 second. It means after he went into the mikveh, and he's called a tful yom. So we have these two psukim. One pasuk seems to indicate ki im rochatz b'sar b'mayim, then that's sufficient. He just needs tara, but nevertheless, the other pasuk, which refers to Gemar Tara, also says Uba Shemesh v'tar v'achar yochal min hakodshim. So as far as the status of a tful yom is concerned, before heriv shemesh, before Seisek Chavim, he's excluded from kodshim and from truma. And yet, Amar Abelazar, afal pi she'aser b'truma kosher b'zoas mechatos shel efer para aduma. And we're going to, by equation, we're going to say the same thing applies to an orel, even though he's aser b'achilas truma, as we learned at great length. Nevertheless, he's kosher lazah. Now we're going to derive the status of Arel in Hazah from the status of a Tful Yom in Hazah. But then again, you're assuming, Rabbi Lazar, in that equation that Arel is, shall we say, less chamur than Tful Yom. But wait a second, maybe it's just the opposite. Maybe Tful Yom is more chamur, because we said before that a Tful Yom is allowed to eat Ma'aser Shenim. So let's see what would be the story with regard to an Orel and Ma'aser Shenim. So the Gemara objects to the following: Ma l'Tful Yom shekei mutar b'Ma'aser Shenim. But an Orel is more chamur. Actually, the Gemara vacillates on this question later on. The note points out on Daf Ayin Gimel, we didn't get to it yet. The Gemara is mistapik whether or not an Orel is allowed to eat Ma'aser Shenim. But the final maskana back on, fast forward to Daf Ayin Dalet, is that an Orel is asur b'Ma'aser Shenim, which makes Orel more chamur than Tful Yom, because Tful Yom is mutar b'Ma'aser Shenim, whereas an Orel is asur b'Ma'aser Shenim. So therefore, can you, Rebbe Lazar, make this equation and say that the kula that applies to Tful Yom should therefore apply to an Orel, and he's kosher Hazah? That doesn't make any sense. It could be that an Orel is posel Hazah, because Haraya, he's excluded from Ma'aser Shenim. And in the case of Tful Yom, we allow him to eat Ma'aser Shenim. The Torah only prohibits him from Truman Kodshim based on Ubah Shemesh V'Toyer. So the Gemara now defends Rabbi Lazar against this onslaught. Atu anan ma'achilo kamrinon. You're right. If we were talking about the question of achila, let's say, for example, if we wanted to derive from Tful Yom a heter for Orel to eat the para, then your dechia, your rejection, would be in place, because we have a chumrah in Orel, he's not allowed to eat Ma'aser Shenim. But anan l'negia kamrina, we're only coming to discuss the question of negia, right? Hazah is negia. And therefore, this is my limud. Ma Tful Yom sha'asa b'negia de truma, and yet mutar behazas para. So we have here, in regard to truma, with regard to negia, we have a chumrah in truma that goes beyond hazah. So that even though a Tful Yom is asur b'negia de truma, which again, the Gemara later on Daf Ayin Hey is going to derive this. Whereas in the case of para, we said that there's a ribui of Vehiza Tar to teach me that it's Tful Yom, who is again asur b'negia b'truma, nevertheless he can do hazah in para. So you see that hazah is lower, it's a lower level than the requirements of the standards of truma. So for truma, a Tful Yom is asur b'negia. I mean, if there was a din of hazah and truma, then a Tful Yom would be excluded. He's mutar in hazah b'para, because negia and truma is more chomer than hazah. Arel is mutar b'negia in truma and kodshim, because he has no status of tumah at all. Is Einudin, how much more so, argues Rabbi Lazar, Shem mutar b'hazah, the zah's para. And Tanya Namihachi, we have a brisa to explicitly support Rabbi Lazar. Orel shehiza hazah kshera. Again, I don't know why it says in a b'di'evet, because if we're upgrading into the status of a Tful Yom, which we said that a Tful Yom is kosher hazah, based on the ribui of Vehiza Tar, then an Orel should likewise be kosher hazah, not that hazah as kshera, but in any event, Masechet, there was actually a case of an oral that did hazah. Sounds like a rare combination, but the oral did hazah. Again, it sounds like the Dieved, in any event. So this is the Shita of Rabbi Lazar, that as far as Hazah, which is Negia, is concerned, we derive RL from a Kal Chomer, from Tful Yom. Tful Yom is awesome in Negia B'Truma. That gives it a Chumradika status, whereas RL is Mutab in Negia B'Truma. And if the Torah says that a Yom is Kosher Hazah, which means that Paraduma is on a lower level than, let's say, Truman Kodsh, and how much more so an RL should be Kosher Hazah. Meisveh. Now the Gemara asks a kasha on Rabbi Lazar from a brayso. Tumtum. So remember, we spoke about a tumtum. We don't know if he's a zachar and a kevish. A kidesh. Kidesh means when you mix the efer apara together with mechatos. That's called kiddush. Kiddush hamayim. So the mayim gets upgraded to the status of mechatos. Kiddusho pasuk. Mipneishu Safek Orel, right on the side that he's a Zocher, he becomes an Orel because he's Chayv Mila and he hasn't been circumcised. The Orel Pasul Kaddish. Now, if we assume, which is a big assumption, but let's assume naively that the requirements of Kaddish are equal to the requirements of Hazah, then this brayso says explicitly that an orel is excluded from kiddush mechatos and therefore ipso facto from hazos mechatos. That's against Rabbi Lazar. The androgynous, and here we add the word mahul. This based on Rashi. Shekidesh kiddusho kosher. Why? Because he's already mahul, so if he's a male, then he's not an orel. And if she is a female, then the chachamim, reflected here in this brayso, are of the opinion that af noshim sheros l'kadish mechatos. Therefore, mimonav shach, the kiddush of an androgynous mahul is kosher. But Rabbi Yehuda Omer, af androgynous shekidesh kiddush Shesafek Isha, on the side that this androgynous is an Isha, the Isha Psula Mila Kaddish. Against the Chacham who say that Af Nashim Ksheros Kaddish, Rabbi Yehuda holds Isha Psula Mila Kaddish. So now the Gemara is ready for its catch. We see explicit in this Orel, or a Safek Orel, in the case of a Tumtum, is Pasal Mila Kaddish. He cannot be Mekadesh Mechatos, and a Tumtum who is Mekadesh Mechatos Kiddush Pasul because he might be a male Orel. Then it makes sense that the Orel should likewise be Pasul Tazos Mechatos. If he's Pasul Kadesh, then he's Pasul Lahazos. Because it's all one reason, meaning that the orel is excluded from any process that's involved in either creating the mechatos or administering the mechatos as part of the Tara process. So this is against Rabbi Lazar. Lazar was machshir an orel in hazas mechatos, and this brayso would indicate that an orel is excluded and disqualified from hazas mechatos. However, what the Gemara is going to try to do now, it's going to try to attribute this brayso that we're learning about Tumtum Shekidesh Kiddusha Apostle to a particular sheet in Tanoim, and Rabbi Lazar doesn't have to buy into that sheet of Tanoim. Omer of Yosef, Hai Tana, the Tana of this brayso who disqualifies the Orel Fazos Mechatos, is Tana de Bei Rabbi Akiva. He comes to the base message of Rabbi Akiva, the Marbileli Orel Kitome. That Rabbi Akiva, in the question of Achilas Truma, had an equation between Orel and Tome. And it's as if the Torah had, so to speak, upgraded the status of an Orel to that of a Tameh. He equated him with a Tameh. And that's why an Orel is excluded from Truma Desanya. We learned in a Brisa. Now, the Brisa actually begins with the dissenting view of Rabbi Eliezer that he derives that an Orel is excluded and prohibited from Achilus Truma from Toshav V'Sachir, the Gzeir Shava between Toshav V'Sachir and Pesach and Toshav V'Sachir in Truma. But Rabbi Akiva Omer, he doesn't need this Gzeir Shava. He derives the Isra Achila of Orel from a pasuk that it says in Truma itself, Ish Ish, Mizera Aaron V'hu Tzarua Ozav, Hakochim Lo Yochal, Ad Asher Yita. So in the Parsha of Truma, the Torah excludes a Tameh, and it says Ish Ish. What's the extra Ish Ish? L'Ravos Orel, that even an Orel is excluded from Truma. Now, according to Rabbi Akiva, Orel, who's not mentioned in this pasuk explicitly of Ish Ish, all that's mentioned here is a Tameh, like a Tzarua or a Zav, and yet, according to Rabbi Akiva's drasha, the Ribui of Ish Ish includes Orel in the pasuk of Tameh. It means it upgrades Orel to the status of a Tameh. When I use upgrade, I mean to equate it. So therefore, according to Rabbi Akiva, if Orel is like a Tameh, he would have an Isa Negia B'Truma. And now we're going to say that from that Isa Negia B'Truma of an Orel, which is again a Pella because he's not a Tameh, but he's considered like a Tameh, then he's Pasal Lazos Mechatas. Like a Tameh would be Pasal Lazos Mechatas. So the Brisa that says an Orel is Pasal Mechatas, in the case of Kiddush Mechatas, that's Rabbi Akiva. That's reflecting the view of Rabbi Akiva. However, we said that Rabbi Eliezer derives the exclusion of an Orel from Achilus Truma from the pasuk, from the Gzeir Shava of Toshav V'Sachir, of Toshav V'Sachir. He disagrees with Rabbi Akiva. He doesn't have in the parsha of Tumah an exclusion of an Orel, so he doesn't have the equation of, or the upgrade as we called it, between Orel and Tameh. And an Orel is not like a Tameh, because an Orel is not Tameh. And therefore, Rabbi Lazar, who says that an Orel is kosher l'maisa para, for example, for Kiddush Mechatas or for Hazah, he holds like the Tana Rabbi Eliezer. So it's Rabbi Lazar holding like Rabbi Eliezer, the Tana who rejects Rabbi Akiva and rejects the equation of Orel Ketam. Omar Rava, Aviyasivna Kamid Rav Yosef, Akash. When I heard this presentation of Rav Yosef, I had a question. Meaning, if you're telling me that according to Rabbi Akiva, an Orel is like a Tameh, with regard to the Isa Negia B'Truma, is Lolish Tameh Tana V'Listei HaOrel V'Atameh. How could it be that we don't find any Tana who will teach us that Orel and Tameh are equal as far as the Isa Negia B'Truma? V'Leim Rabbi Akiva. And we would interpret such a Tana in the light of Rabbi Akiva. And we don't find such a Tana who says such. Therefore, it must mean that even Rabbi Akiva agrees that Orel is not like a Tameh for all equations, for all purposes, such that now you'd be Metabe B'Negiyah, so he's not Tameh, this Orel. He's like a Tameh as far as his psul, his exclusion from Achilus Truma. And that which it says explicitly in the Brisa that an Orel is possible azos mechatos, that's not because of the Tumah Shabo, but rather because of the nature of the dinim of para, which are chamurim, and they passel an Orel. But this din of psul Orel leparaduma is not in any way dependent upon the machlok shim Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Lazar as to how we derive the exclusion of Orel from Truma, whether it's Gzeir Shava or Ish Ish. So the Gemara now is is amazed about Rava's statement here. V'chilo, do you not find a Tana who equates an Oral with a Tameh? V'katani in the Bryce it says, Ha'oral v'tameh p'turim min ha're'iyah. The mitzvah aliyah l'regel to the Migdash on Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. Sholosh pam b'shani yerakol skruchas pnei Adon Hashem. And the Bryce excludes an Oral and a Tameh. Now, why is it an Ariel potter from Re'iyah? The obvious answer is because his status is equal to that of a Tameh, l'chol davar. Therefore, be mitami b'negiyasa. And the Gemara answers to defend Rava, Hasam mishum demois. The reason why an Ariel is excluded from Re'iyah is nothing to do with the fact that he's a Tameh, which would make him a Tameh even linyan negiyah, but rather mishum demois. It's mois for such a person, li rose ba'azor, the mitzvah is to show up in the azor. But it comes out that even the Chachamim reject Rabbi Akiva, and they don't agree that Oral is the Tameh. They derive Oral from the exclusion of Oral from Truma from the Shava. They concede that an Oral is Potem in Ariyah from a different reason, not because he's equated with a Tameh, but because he's modes li rose ba'azor. So when the Bryce says that Oral v'Tameh p'turim in Ariyah, that's according to everybody. Now, in the Bryce that the Gemara brought above, there's a machlok shin chacham and Rabbi Yehuda regarding androgynous, who is makadesh the meichatos, whether that kiddush is kosher or possible. The azlu tamayu, and these shitos of chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda respectively reflect their consistent shitos in another brisa. They are consistent with the sanya hakol ksherim lekadesh, according to the Tanakama. All the tahorim, even a woman, are ksherim lekadesh to mix the efer parah with the mechatos and a kucheres. Chutz mi cheresh shota v'katan. Rabbi Yehuda machshir v'katan uposel be'isha ubandrogenes. Rabbi Yehuda allows a katan, or I should say qualifies a katan for kiddush, to be ma'ariv the mei chatos with the efer para, but on the other hand, he excludes an isha, and therefore an androgynous is a suffix isha, from kiddush. My time of the Rabbanan. Why do they exclude katan, and yet they qualify the isha? Tichsiv, it says in the avoda of kiddush, v'lokhu latome me'afar sreifas achatos, and the end of the pasuk is v'nosan olav ma'im pili. Hanach the pasli basifa psulim b'kiddush. Hanach the ksherim basifa ksherim b'kiddush. So if you look at this pasuk, v'lokhu latome me'afar sreifas hapara, so we're talking about psulim basifas efer hapara. Now, who are excluded, disqualified from asifas efer hapara? That's cheresh shel katan. Because with regard to asifas efer hapara, the Torah says v'asaf ish tahar es efer hapara iniach michutz hamachne makom tahar. And from the fact that it says v'asaf ish is coming to exclude cheresh shel katan, that psulim for asifas hapara, where it says ish. Yosef Ish. They are therefore, according to the Rabbanan, psulim lekiddush as well. However, those who are ksherim basifa, for example, an isha, as they darshan from the extra word tar, that an isha is ksherabo. This is Rashi quoting a Gemara in Masechet Yomi, Daf Mem Gimel. So an isha is ksheira lekiddush, ksherim bekiddush, and therefore they are ksherim for both Asifa and Kiddush. Again, there's a special drasha in the parsha of the Asaf Ish Tar, that Tar is coming as an extra word to include an Isha, and that's with regard to Asifa of Ephra Para. And from Asifa of Ephra Para, we're going to derive Kiddush when they mix the Mei Chatos with the Ephra Para, the Ephra Para. Because immediately after the Avod of Asifa, the Torah speaks about the Avod of Kiddush, v'lokhu latame me'afar sreifas achat v'nosan olav chaim el keli. So the v'lokhu of Kiddush is dafka those who are kosher l'asifa in the previous pasuk. And since in Isha we were marbeh from the word tar, is ksheira l'asifa, therefore she's ksheira l'kiddush. Now, a katan is excluded from asifa, and therefore he's disqualified for kiddush because there's equation between asifa and kiddush. That's the sheet of the Rabban. Now we go on to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda, he's machshir even a katan. He must be differentiating between asifa and kiddush. So he's going to allow the katan to do the kiddush, even though a katan is excluded from asifa. Amal Rabbi Yehuda would respond in Cain, if avodas kiddush is equal in its dinim to avodas asifa, even with regard to katan, his name akra. The pasuk with regard to the avod of kiddush should have said v'lokach. In fact, the pasuk says v'lokchu. So v'lokach is in lashon yachid, and it's if it would have said v'lokach, it would parallel avodas asifa where it says v'asaf ishtar in the singular. My v'lokchu. Why does the Torah then use v'lokchu b'lashon ramin? It must be telling us the afilu hanach de psulim hasam ksherim hacha. Even those who are excluded from the avod of asifa, for example, a katan is ksherim hacha, is kosher l'kiddush. So Gemara asks, hachi isha nami. According to Rabbi Yehuda, the pasuk is saying that even if you're excluded from asifa, it's still kosher l'kiddush. Then a woman should be ksheira l'kiddush, which is indeed the shita of the Tanakama, but not of Rabbi Yehuda. Why does Rabbi Yehuda disqualify an isha for kiddush when they're ksheira li'asifa? So the Gemara responds that there's another limud here, that an isha is excluded, disqualified from kiddush, because it says v'nasan, which is an extra redundant word. And it's teaching me that an ish nosein v'lo v'nasna, to exclude the feminine. Eina isha nosein. So the Gemara asks for Rabbanan, who say that only those who are ksherim l'asifa are ksherim l'kiddush, and therefore katan, who's excluded from kiddush, is excluded from. I'm saying a katan who's excluded from asifa is therefore excluded from kiddush. So why does it say v'lakhu in lashon rab? Why not v'lakach, the lashon yachid, which is the same limud that Rabbi Yehuda, from which Rabbi Yehuda derived the conclusion that a katan is kosher. So the Gemara answers iksiv v'lakach. If it would have said v'lakach v'lashon yachid, like it says in Avodas Kiddush v'Nasan v'Loshen Yachid, Hava Mina Shakil Chad v'Yoiv Chad. We would make the following mistake, that the same person who was v'lokach v'Nasan as ha'efer b'toch me'achatos, he's the one who has to do the irbuv mayim. Is Kosev Rachman of a Lokhu to teach us that you can split it into two people. You don't have to have the same Velokach V'Nosan Se'efer as the one who is Ma'arbe V'Samayim. So it says here V'Nosan, and if it would have said Velokach, it would be Shokil Chad B'Yoiv Chad. We would make the mistake that the person who's Velokach, he's got to be the same person of V'Nosan. Is therefore Kosev Rachman of a Lokhu in the plural to teach us they could have two different people. One is Velokach, and the other is V'Nosan. Because of Rachmana, if we would have said Velokhu V'Nosnu, both in Loshen Ram, Havamina de Shakli Trey, V'Yovi Trey. We'd say that the same two who took and put the Afer into the Mechatos, they're the ones who have to do the Irba V'Mayim. It's therefore Kosrach one of Velokhu V'Nosan, Nafilu Shakli Trey, V'Yoiv Chad. Sufficient that two did the Velokach V'Nosan, and one did the Irbuv Hamayim. And now on Daf Ayin Gimel, the Gemara brings now a source for the halacha that a Tful Yom is kosher fazos mechatos. It says Vehiza Ator al Atome, and the word Vator is completely redundant because even if the pasuk had not mentioned Ator, then we would know that the maza is tor because the pasuk says that the mayim tahurim hametarim are called mechatos. So akrovas chatos always has to be done b'tara. So why did the Torah have to add the word tor? Tor michlal shu tomeh. That the maza is tor with regard to one din, but he's tomeh with regard to other din. Is limed al tful yom chekoser b'meipar, b'hazos meipar. Okay, so this is where we're going to stop here on the top of Daf Ayin Gimel. Boy mine. Takes opportunity to wish you a great Shabbos.